It was an ordinary morning at a bustling luxury hotel, until a black man walked in and everything changed. The staff mocked him, laughed at him, and degraded him just because of his skin color. What these racist hotel workers didn't realize was that their cruelty would lead to a moment that would leave them utterly speechless. The twist in this story isn't just shocking, it's life-changing. Watch till the end to see how justice was served in the most powerful way. The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of the hotel lobby, casting golden reflections on the polished marble floors. The air was filled with the soft hum of classical music, the occasional clink of glasses from the nearby cafe, and the rhythmic typing of a receptionist at the front desk. To anyone passing by, it seemed like just another ordinary day in this luxury hotel, elegance and efficiency in perfect harmony. Then he walked in. He was an older black man, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a well-worn suit that had clearly seen better days. His shoes were scuffed, and his suitcase, an old leather bag with frayed edges, looked like it had been by his side for decades. He stepped in slowly, taking a moment to glance around, as if marveling at the grandeur of the place. But it wasn't just admiration in his eyes. It was something deeper, a mix of awe and apprehension, as though he wasn't sure if he truly belonged there. Behind the counter, two staff members exchanged a glance, their lips curling into barely concealed smirks. One of them, a young woman with a sharp nose and an air of condescension, whispered something to her colleague, a tall man with a crisp suit and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. As the guest approached the counter, the young woman stepped forward, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. "Good morning," she said, her voice dripping with insincere politeness. "Can I help you?" There was a pause, just long enough to make the man shift uncomfortably. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice gentle yet dignified. "I have a reservation. It's under Williams." Her brow arched. "A reservation?" she repeated, as if the very idea was absurd. She tapped on her keyboard with exaggerated precision, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment, her tone now flat. "I don't see anything under that name. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The man nodded, his hands gripping the handle of his suitcase tightly. "Yes, ma'am. This is the right place. I made the reservation a month ago." The tall man behind her stepped in, his smile now faintly mocking. "Sir, this is a 5-star hotel. Are you certain this is where you booked your stay?" A quiet hush seemed to fall over the room. The few other guests milling about cast quick, curious glances toward the counter. The man's cheeks flushed slightly, but he stood his ground. "Yes, I am certain." The woman let out a small, barely audible laugh. "Well, I don't know what to tell you, sir. We don't have anything under your name. But," the man began, only to be interrupted by the tall man, who leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "Look, we have a dress code here. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at one of the motels down the road. They're much more accommodating." The words hit him like a slap. He blinked, the flush in his cheeks deepening as he looked around, hoping for someone to step in, to say something, anything. But the other guests averted their eyes, their interest quickly replaced by discomfort. Still, he straightened his back, holding on to his dignity. "I'd like to speak to your manager," he said firmly, his voice unwavering despite the tension in the air. The young woman rolled her eyes, but pressed a button on the phone. "Mr. Carter, could you come to the front desk, please?" A moment later, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit appeared, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, looking between the staff and the guest. Before the man could respond, the young woman jumped in. "This gentleman claims he has a reservation, but there's nothing under his name. We were just explaining that this might not be the right hotel for him." The manager's gaze shifted to the older man, who stood there with quiet determination. "Do you have a confirmation email?" he asked. The man fumbled with his bag, pulling out a printed sheet of paper and handing it over. The manager glanced at it, his expression tightening for a split second before he looked up, his professional mask firmly in place. "There seems to have been a mix-up," he said smoothly. "We don't have your room ready at the moment, but we can look into it." The man nodded, his relief evident. "Thank you." But the staff behind the counter weren't done. As the manager walked away, the tall man muttered under his breath, loud enough for his colleague to hear. "Probably used a fake card to book it. Bet he doesn't even have the money to pay." The young woman stifled a laugh, her hand covering her mouth. The words carried across the lobby like poison, infecting the air with cruelty. The older man heard it. He paused, his shoulders stiffening. But he said nothing. Not yet. As the older man stood in the lobby, trying to maintain his composure, he couldn't ignore the sting of the staff's laughter. Every whispered insult, every sideways glance cut deeper than they realized. But this wasn't the first time he'd faced something like this, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He adjusted his tie, smoothing the fabric over his chest as if it were armor. Years ago he might have lashed out, demanded justice on the spot. But now he had learned the value of patience. Justice, he believed, always revealed itself in time. The manager returned, his expression carefully blank as he handed back the confirmation email. "It seems your reservation was misplaced. We'll have a room prepared for you shortly. Please have a seat in the lounge while we sort everything out." "Thank you," the man said simply, his voice calm despite the humiliation burning in his chest. He turned toward the lounge, his suitcase rolling quietly behind him. As he walked away, the staff at the counter exchanged looks. "I can't believe he's actually staying here," the young woman muttered, loud enough for her voice to carry. The tall man chuckled again, leaning casually against the counter. "I give it a day before he's out of here. Probably can't even afford room service," he said, smirking. Seated in the lounge, the older man pretended not to hear, but the words echoed in his mind. He opened his suitcase, pulling out a worn leather notebook. It was filled with pages of notes, sketches, and receipts. He flipped through it absently, as though trying to distract himself, but the sting of their words lingered. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him. He remembered walking into stores as a child, feeling the weight of suspicion from shopkeepers who thought he might steal. He remembered being passed over for promotions at work, despite being the most qualified. And now, decades later, here he was, still being judged by the color of his skin, still being told, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that he didn't belong. A waiter approached, breaking his train of thought. "Would you care for some coffee or tea, sir?" the young man asked, his tone warm and respectful, a welcome contrast to the staff at the front desk. "Just water, please," the older man said, offering a polite smile. The waiter nodded and hurried off, leaving him alone with his thoughts once more. Across the lobby, the tall man leaned toward the young woman, whispering something that made her laugh. Their voices, low but deliberate, carried fragments of mockery. "Cheap suit. Probably thinks this is his big break. Doesn't belong." The older man glanced up, catching their gaze for just a moment, before they quickly looked away. He said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness, it was resolve. He wasn't here to argue with small minds. Moments later, the manager reappeared, his expression strained. "Mr. Williams," he said, forcing a smile, "your room is ready. We'll have someone bring your bags up for you." The man rose slowly, his back straight, and followed the manager toward the elevators. The receptionist's snickering voices faded as the elevator doors closed, leaving only the faint hum of the machinery. When they reached the room, the manager opened the door, revealing a modest but comfortable space. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to call the front desk," he said. "Thank you," the man replied, his voice steady. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and set his suitcase on the bed. For a moment, he stood there in silence, gazing out the window at the city below. The view was beautiful, skyscrapers towering over busy streets, the sunlight glinting off glass and steel. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was on the words he'd heard in the lobby, the way they had laughed at him like he was less than human. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. He pressed the number, lifting the phone to his ear. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "I'm here." The voice on the other end responded quickly, a mix of concern and curiosity. "How did it go?" He paused, glancing around the room before answering. "Exactly as I expected," he said with a faint smile. There was a brief silence before the voice spoke again. "Do you want me to move forward with the plan?" The older man hesitated for just a moment, then nodded, even though the person on the other end couldn't see him. "Yes," he said firmly. "It's time." As he hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over him. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And by the time this was over, those who had mocked him would finally understand the consequences of their actions. He sat down at the small desk in the corner of the room, opening his notebook once more. The pages were filled with years of meticulous planning, but there was one entry he lingered on, a single line written in bold letters. "The measure of a person's character is how they treat those they believe are beneath them." He leaned back in his chair, letting the words sink in. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing inside the hotel. The next morning, the hotel hummed with activity. Guests filtered in and out of the lobby, bellhops rushed to carry luggage, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The older man emerged from the elevator, his worn suit still neatly pressed, his leather notebook tucked under his arm. He walked calmly to the breakfast area, greeting the staff who avoided meeting his eyes. He sat at a corner table, quietly sipping his coffee and observing the scene. The tall man from the front desk was now chatting loudly with a group of colleagues near the concierge desk. His laughter carried across the room, each chuckle a reminder of the humiliation the man had endured the day before. But today, the older man's demeanor was different. There was no hesitation in his movements, no unease in his posture. He looked as if he was waiting for something, or someone. At precisely 10 a.m., the double doors of the lobby swung open, and a group of people strode in. They were dressed sharply, their tailored suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to the casual travelers around them. At the center was a woman in her 40s, her presence commanding as she carried a sleek leather briefcase. The staff froze, their conversations halting mid-sentence. The tall man's smile faltered as the woman approached the front desk, flanked by two assistants. She leaned in, speaking softly but firmly to the receptionist. The words were inaudible to the older man from across the room, but he could see the young woman's face pale as she nodded nervously. Moments later, the manager appeared, his professional mask slipping into a look of thinly veiled concern. The group began walking toward the conference rooms, and as they passed, the woman caught sight of the older man sitting at his table. She gave him a subtle nod, and he returned it with a faint smile. By lunchtime, whispers had started spreading through the hotel staff. "Who are they?" one server whispered to another. "Did you see the way the manager ran to them? They must be important." The tall man from the front desk dismissed the rumors with a wave of his hand. "Probably just some corporate inspection. Nothing to worry about," he said with a smug grin. But a flicker of doubt crossed his face as he glanced toward the older man, who was now speaking quietly to one of the assistants. The tension in the air grew thicker as the afternoon wore on. Staff members whispered behind closed doors, and the manager was seen rushing back and forth from his office, his normally calm demeanor replaced with visible stress. By 4 p.m., the older man received a call on his hotel room phone. "It's time," the voice on the other end said. He hung up and made his way downstairs, his leather notebook once again in hand. As he entered the lobby, he saw the group from earlier standing in a semicircle near the front desk. The woman in charge gestured for him to join them, her expression unreadable but respectful. The manager stood off to the side, his face pale and his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The tall man and the young receptionist from the previous day were also there, their confident smirks now replaced with uneasy frowns. The woman stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the gathered staff. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Harold Williams." All eyes turned to the older man, who stood quietly, his hands resting on the handle of his suitcase. The silence stretched, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. "Mr. Williams is not just a guest at this hotel," the woman continued. "He is one of the principal investors in this chain. In fact, without his support, this very property wouldn't exist." Gasps rippled through the staff, their disbelief evident. The tall man took a step back, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. "Yesterday, Mr. Williams was subjected to treatment that is not only unacceptable, but completely at odds with the values this organization stands for," the woman said, her tone growing sharper. "And today, we are here to ensure that such behavior is never repeated." The manager stepped forward, his face a mixture of panic and contrition. "Mr. Williams, I assure you this was a misunderstanding. But Harold held up a hand, silencing him. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath his words. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was prejudice, plain and simple. He turned to the tall man and the young receptionist, his gaze unwavering. "You didn't see a man who deserved respect. You saw a man you thought you could belittle. And for what? The way I look? The color of my skin?" The staff shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the floor. "I've faced this kind of treatment my whole life," Harold continued. "But yesterday, in this hotel, a place I helped build, I saw something worse than ignorance. I saw cruelty, and I cannot, will not, allow it to stand." The woman stepped in again, her voice firm. "Effective immediately, the individuals responsible for this incident will be relieved of their duties. Furthermore, mandatory diversity and sensitivity training will be implemented for all staff." The tall man's face turned red, his indignation bubbling over. "You can't do this," he began, but the woman cut him off with a glare. "Yes, we can," she said coldly, "and we will." Harold's voice softened as he addressed the rest of the staff. "This isn't about revenge, it's about respect. Everyone who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from." The staff nodded slowly, their expressions a mix of shame and understanding. As Harold turned to leave, the lobby was silent. The tall man and the receptionist stood frozen, their once confident demeanors shattered. Harold paused at the door, looking back one last time. "I'll be watching," he said simply. And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a hotel that would never be the same. The news of what happened in the hotel lobby spread like wildfire. By the next day, whispers and murmurs filled every corner of the property. Staff members exchanged uneasy glances as they carried out their tasks, the weight of Harold Williams' words still hanging over them. Meanwhile, Harold sat in his room, gazing out at the city skyline. His phone buzzed with messages of support and updates from his colleagues. He responded to each one with calm professionalism, but his thoughts were elsewhere. This wasn't just about punishing the staff who had wronged him. This was about sending a message that prejudice and cruelty have no place in any space, least of all one he had invested in. Later that afternoon, Harold descended to the lobby once more. The atmosphere had changed. Staff members who had avoided his gaze the day before now greeted him with quiet respect. Even the guests, who had overheard parts of the confrontation, treated him with newfound deference. As he approached the manager's office, the woman from the corporate team was waiting for him. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Mr. Williams," she said, "we've handled the immediate issues, but there's more work to be done. Do you have time to discuss next steps?" "Of course," Harold replied, following her into the office. The meeting lasted over an hour. They reviewed policies, outlined a new code of conduct, and discussed plans for training sessions to ensure that every staff member, from the front desk to housekeeping, understood the importance of diversity, respect, and inclusion. Harold's input was measured but firm, his decades of experience evident in every suggestion he made. As the meeting concluded, the woman leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Williams," she said, "your response to this incident has been remarkable. Most people would have reacted with anger, but you've handled this with grace and purpose. I think we could learn a lot from you." Harold gave her a small, thoughtful smile. "Grace doesn't mean letting people off the hook," he said. "It means holding them accountable while showing them a better way forward. Change takes time, but it starts with moments like this." The woman nodded, clearly moved by his words. Before leaving the office, Harold asked for one final request. "I'd like to meet with the rest of the staff," he said. "Everyone, not just those involved in the incident." The woman agreed, and an hour later, the entire hotel team gathered in the conference room. The tension was palpable as Harold entered the room. He stood at the front, his leather notebook in hand, and let his gaze sweep over the crowd. "I asked to speak with all of you because this isn't just about one incident," he began, his voice calm but steady. "This is about a culture that needs to change. What happened to me was hurtful, yes, but it's part of a much bigger problem. And if we don't address it, it will happen again, to someone else." He paused, letting his words sink in. Some staff members looked uncomfortable, others ashamed. "I grew up in a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this," Harold continued. "I worked hard to change that, not just for myself but for everyone who comes after me. So when I walk into a hotel that I've invested in, a place I helped build, and I'm treated like I don't belong, it's not just disrespectful, it's heartbreaking." The room was silent. A few staff members shifted in their seats, their faces reflecting a mix of guilt and realization. "But this isn't just about me," Harold said, his tone softening. "It's about all of us, guests, employees, and the community we serve. We have a responsibility to create a space where everyone feels valued, no matter who they are or where they come from." He closed his notebook and took a step closer to the crowd. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to challenge you, to do better, to be better, because that's how we grow, not just as individuals, but as a team." A few heads nodded. One young housekeeper raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice trembling, "I want to apologize. I wasn't involved in what happened, but I saw how they treated you. I didn't say anything and I should have. I'm sorry." Harold smiled warmly. "It takes courage to admit that," he said. "And it's a step in the right direction. Thank you." The room seemed to relax slightly, the tension easing as Harold's words continued to resonate. By the end of the meeting, the staff gave him a standing ovation, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Harold left the room knowing that while the change wouldn't happen overnight, the seeds had been planted. As he packed his suitcase that evening, Harold received a call from the corporate team. "Mr. Williams," the voice said, "we'd like to feature your story in our next diversity initiative. Your leadership has inspired us, and we think it could inspire others too." Harold chuckled softly. "If it helps people learn, then I'm all for it," he said. He hung up the phone and glanced at his notebook one last time before closing it. The words he had written years ago still held true. The measure of a person's character is how they treat those they believe are beneath them. As he walked out of the hotel and into the night, Harold felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He hadn't just reclaimed his dignity, he had sparked a movement, and for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. As Harold walked out of the hotel for the last time, his thoughts lingered on everything that had transpired. This wasn't just about him, it was about a lifetime of experiences, a collection of moments where dignity and respect had been denied. He paused, looking back at the building one final time, and thought about the lesson he hoped everyone inside would carry forward. The measure of a person's character, he murmured to himself, is how they treat those they believe are beneath them. For Harold, this was more than a personal victory. It was a reminder of the power of patience and persistence. It was proof that injustice can be challenged with grace, that the smallest acts of change can ripple outward in ways we don't always see. This moment wasn't just about confronting prejudice, it was about leaving a legacy.